Molecules are the building blocks of life, and as the name would suggest, macromolecules are the larger ones. There are four main types of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. These two, the carbohydrates and lipids, are simpler and more straightforward to understand. These two, on the other hand, can be a bit more complicated. Before we dive into them, I want to first talk about the differences between a monomer and a polymer. A monomer is a single macromolecule. It's just like one brick. They can do some things, but it's not that complicated on its own. A polymer is two or more macromolecules. This is like having a whole bunch of bricks put together. They can form a structure and do more things. The monomer of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. It'll look something like this. It's a single hexamer. The polymer of the carbohydrate is just going to be multiple of these monosaccharides lined up together. The structure of these polymers can vary, but they generally are just a bunch of these hexamers put together. These hexamers are supposed to look like hexagons, but with the way I've drawn them, they look more like little sacs, which is similar to how monosaccharides sounds like. Same with polysaccharides. You can imagine them as just a bunch of sacs together. That's how I like to remember. The function of these carbohydrates is short-term energy and to maintain structure. It's kind of like how they're structured together like this, just a bunch of hexagons. They're much more unified in that sense compared to the other macromolecules. As I said earlier, carbs are one of the simpler of the macromolecules. It only is composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All the macromolecules have these three. It's just that carbs don't have anything else generally. Next up is lipids. The monomer for lipids are going to look something like this. This is a lazier drawing of what a lipid would look like. You could also see something like this, where it's just a series of lines with hydrogen on both ends. These, on their own, are just fatty acids. However, together, the polymer form is just lipids again. These are what we call hydrocarbon chains, because they have hydrogen, and this chain is composed of carbon. Lipids are important for long-term energy storage. It's kind of like how it's difficult to burn fat through exercise. It takes a long time. Lipids also do a good job of insulating and keeping heat inside a organism's body. That's why a lot of animals have like body fat or blubber in order to keep themselves warm. As the second simpler macromolecule, as I said earlier, they also only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, two key things to note about lipids is that they're hydrophobic, which means they don't like to be exposed to water. They'll move away from water. Think of how like oil tries to separate itself from water when you attempt to mix them together. There's also two different forms of lipids. There's the unsaturated lipids and the saturated lipids. These ones that I've drawn here are saturated because they're on a straight line and they don't break off. Unsaturated lipids would look something like this. They would kind of bend at this point because they'd have what we call a double bond versus like the single bonds that happen here. This bend happens because due to the double bond, there's one less hydrogen stick from this point, whereas in a saturated lipid, it would just keep going straight. Next, I want to talk about proteins. This is where we get into the two relatively more complicated macromolecules. Proteins are composed of amino acids. That's the monomer of proteins. We usually picture them as just circles. You put these amino acids together to create a polypeptide chain, which is the polymer of proteins. Proteins have very complicated structures. They fold together and form unique structures in order to do different functions. It would be too much to cover like the way proteins fold in this video, so I'll do that in a different one. For now, I'll talk about what they do. Proteins can repair tissue. They can be enzymes. Those are the things that tend to look like little Pac-Mans. Enzymes catalyze chemical reactions, which means they just make it go faster and use less energy. Proteins also help with cell communication. They can be on the cell membrane of a cell and be like a sign almost to talk to other cells nearby who would have a protein of their own in order to communicate between the two cells. Proteins also help with transportation of materials between the two cells. There's usually these other types of proteins on the cell membrane that'll help little clunky and chunky bits of materials enter or exit the cell. Proteins are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen like all the others, but also have nitrogen and sulfur. And finally, I want to discuss nucleic acid. The monomer of a nucleic acid is just a nucleotide. That's gonna look like a sugar, which is actually a carbon, a phosphate over here, and the line itself, which is a nitrogenous base, which will look like the stick. These sugars are like the ladder of the DNA. These are the lines that go on the side of the DNA. And the nitrogenous bases are the lines between them. If this was DNA, we'd have an opposite side here as well. And as I said earlier, the little extensions behind the ladder are phosphates. And so the polymer of these nucleotides is just the whole thing. It's just a whole bunch of these nucleotides with the phosphate, sugar, and base. I'll go over the structure here in more detail in a different video. The function of the nucleic acid is very simple. It's just genetic material. It stores genetic information as DNA or RNA. It is composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, again like all the other ones. This time it has nitrogen as well, but unlike the proteins, it has phosphorus. Now that we've gone over all the macromolecules, there's one more little thing that I believe is necessary to cover in this video. Monomers and polymers don't just switch between the two magically. There's a process which one can go from just a single macromolecule to joining with other single macromolecules to become a polymer. And of course, there's a way to break up the polymer into multiple monomers. First, we'll talk about how they break apart. This happens through a process called hydrolysis. Hydrolysis is a process where one polymer, just one big molecule, pretend these are atoms here, it can be anything, and molecules of water mix. Now, what the water does here is it goes in and it breaks apart this bond that's happening between these two. So what will happen here is these ones on the left will end up with either H or OH, that's possible too. It depends on the certain properties of the molecule. In the other side, the right side in this case, will end up with the other half of the water. So you'll have, I'll put OH here because we put H over here, but these can interchange. Again, it depends on the properties of these two. But the point is, water comes in and breaks the molecule apart. Now, more waters can mean more breaks, and this molecule can be bigger, and all that good stuff. It's just the fundamental process here that I'm doing. It's an example. Now, the other way is also possible. You could have a bunch of small molecules, which would have H or OH, again it depends, and others that would have the opposite. And then, due to some sort of circumstances, these two would come together and eject the water back out. Then you'd end up with the polymer and extra water. This is dehydration synthesis. It's synthesizing these two molecules into a big one through dehydration by removing water. You're essentially dehydrating these molecules in order to bring them together, in order to synthesize them. That's all that I wanted to cover in this video. Thank you for listening to my explanation. If you like the way I explain these concepts, do subscribe to the channel. I will be adding more videos for more topics. And if you have any questions or if you're confused by anything, just comment and I'll respond, I'll explain it. And even if you're just curious about a different topic, then I'll be happy to answer that as well.